Task force members, please announce when you are back so that we can make sure that we proceed with the quorum. Thank you.
Here, Don Maki.
Amos Brown is here.
Yvonne Lewis.
Bradford chair. Monica Montgomery Step here.
Cheryl Grills here. So we have at least 7 members present. So that establishes a quorum. But at this time, I'll refer to Parliamentary Johnson, who will then refer to Ms. Belton to take a formal roll call vote. Parliamentary Johnson.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Ms. Belton, can you please call the roll and establish a quorum?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. I will now go through the task force members and ask that they announce their presence. Chair Moore.
Present.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown.
Present.
Senator Stephen Bradford.
Here.
Dr. Cheryl Grills.
Present.
Lisa Holder. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer.
Here.
Dr. Javon Scott Lewis.
Present.
Don Tamaki.
Here.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp.
Here.
There are 9 task force members, and the number needed for a quorum is 5. There are currently 8 task force members present. Madam Chair, a quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. I hope you all had a good break. Before we go to action item 7, which is our witness panel number 2, I wanted to make a brief comment related to expert testimony from Professor Brooks and making a clear distinctions between the institution of chattel slavery and indentured servitude, right? So under the systems of indentured servitude, whereby there were white people who were victims of that institution, many of these white people, they committed crimes whereby they had to contract to labor for a certain amount of time, and then they would be freed. We can in no way compare that system to the system of chattel slavery. No Black or African person, signed a contract to be enslaved, and we didn't commit. Our ancestors didn't commit a crime. Our only crime was being Black and was being of our lineage. Also, I wanted to make a really quick comment. Understandably, the conversation around reparations 15, 20 years ago wasn't as serious as it is now. And I want to acknowledge, right, Chris Rock's stand-up and Dave Chappelle's skit, which we will probably potentially discuss in December when we talk about Hollywood and media. But we have to also acknowledge that the conversation around reparations has gained monumental credence since those moments in time. And again, we can't ignore that, right? We have, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote his monumental piece in The Atlantic talking about the case for reparations and tying it to housing discrimination. We have the 1619 Project, was a monumental project coming out of the New York Times that talked about the institution of slavery and the need for reparations. And again, we have this task force, which consists of prominent academics and lawyers and legislators. And so this conversation, as I said, has monumental credence, and we have to acknowledge that. Now we'll go to agenda item number 7, which is our witness panel number 2. As a reminder, each witness panel testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. I will now introduce our esteemed expert witnesses. Dr. Dinah Ramey Berry. Professor Berry is the chair of the History Department and the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor in History at the University of Texas, Austin. Professor Berry grew up in California and is an award-winning author and editor of 6 books and several scholarly articles. One of her recent books, The Price for the Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to the Grave in the Building of a Nation. She has appeared and serves as a consultant for museums, historical societies, radio, and television shows. Professor Stacy Smith. Professor Smith is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. Her book, Freedmen's Frontier, California and the Struggle Over Unfree Labor, Emancipation, and Reconstruction, won the inaugural David Montgomery Award in the United States Labor and Working Class History. Her newest book project, An Empire for Freedom, explores African Americans' migrations to the Pacific Coast in the middle of the 19th century and their struggle for equality. And last but certainly not least, John Burgess. Jonathan Burgess is a real estate broker and the co-owner of the Burgess Brothers brand. Mr. Burgess is a California native and a 5th-generation direct descendant of enslaved people who worked the gold mines in Coloma, California. Professor Berry will begin with her statement and will have 20 minutes. Then Professor Stacy Smith will begin with her statement and she also has 20 minutes. And then John Burgess will have 10 minutes. And then the task force will ask these 3 experts any questions they have or make any comments they have. And we have an hour reserved for that. Now at this time, I would like to recognize Professor Berry.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to testify about the history of slavery and the 2 systems of slave trading that had a significant impact on our history, the transatlantic and domestic slave trade. But before I begin, I turn to the enslaved. When asked about her experience with slavery upon reaching freedom in Canada, one woman who would only give her name as Mrs. said, quote, "For those who wish to apologize for slavery, I ask that they go and experience it for a while." These words struck me when I first read them. They humbled me and continue to keep me centered when I write about this institution and when I teach about the institution of slavery. I am the daughter of the state of California. I was born and raised in Northern California, and I went to college in Southern California at UCLA. So it is an honor to be in front of this body. I'm also honored to come and testify as a descendant of the enslaved. This is a tough history, but it is American history. As noted, I am the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor of History at UT Austin. I am the first scholar of color to chair the department in the department's 133 years of history, male or female, and I'm honored to do so. I have authored, co-authored, and edited 7 award-winning books on the history of slavery, including an encyclopedia, Enslaved Women in America, a book called A Black Woman's History of the United States, co-authored with Callie Nicole Gross, which was a finalist for the NAACP Image Award in 2021, and my favorite, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave in the Building of a Nation. And that is what serves as the foundation of my testimony to you today. I have spent more than 20 years in the academy teaching courses at large public institutions, training more than a dozen PhD students, and publishing scholarly books and articles. I have also been a champion for pre-K through 12 education, where I host professional development workshops, teacher trainings for educators all across the country. And I am a consultant, continuing to consult for museums, historical societies, educational websites, documentary films, etc. In 2016, I was honored to be able to work as the historical consultant for the remake of Roots. And I worked on set, I worked on the scripts, and every aspect of that monumental film. I thrive on teaching about the history of slavery and the experiences of the enslaved, and some of my best teaching moments have been in the classroom and in the community. So my testimony will begin with a short overview of the transatlantic and domestic slave trades, and a discussion of the experiences of the enslaved. And I will close with some of the financial ramifications of this approximately 240-year history. From Olaudah Equiano, Omar Ibn Said, and others, we learn about the capture and Middle Passage experience of the transatlantic slave trade. This is the forced removal of African people to New World plantation communities. This trade lasted 400 years. Scholars estimate that 12 million souls were stolen from a 3,500-mile coastline along the West African coast. Olaudah Equiano tells us about his capture. One day, when our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind our house, two men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both, without giving us time to cry out or make resistance. They stopped our mouths and ran us off into the nearest woods. From here, Olaudah Equiano and his sister and millions of others were taken on about a 300-mile journey, depending on how far in they lived in different countries of West Africa or even Central Africa. They were taken on a 300-mile journey to the coastline, and oftentimes they were taken to places that they did not know existed, and they witnessed and saw bodies of water that they never knew were as wide as they were. You can read his testimony. I will provide citations for all of the sources I'm talking about today. Omar Said, a Muslim from a different part of Africa, had this to say about his capture. Then came to our place a large army who killed many men and took me and brought me to the great sea and sold me into the hands of the Christians, who bound me and sent me on board a great ship, and we sailed upon the great sea a month and a half, when we came to the place called Charleston in the Christian language. Now, the literature on the transatlantic slave trade is vast, and we know a whole lot about the experience, not only from African captives, but also from sailors, from ship captains, from surgeons, and other imperial governments who authorized this trade in human souls. Early scholars in the 1970s focused on the numbers, and they spent decades debating the number of Africans that were lost or captured. And they settled on the figure 12 million. This figure is not large enough to calculate all of the lives that were taken, and it does not include those who died. Some of those died along the journey to the coastline. Some of them died when they were put in holding facilities, such as fortifications or forts, where they were kept sometimes as long as 8 months. Some of them died on the first small boat that they were put on before they were put into large slavers. Those numbers, those individuals have not been calculated. When we say 12 million, we're talking about the records that survived, the records that have been cataloged, and the records that are a part of the Slavery Voyages website, where you can actually look at various ships and find out where they went, and look specifically about the number of quote-unquote cargo that was taken and the number that was disembarked in New World plantation societies. I would argue, and I've said this over and over again, that the baseline, the body of the Atlantic Ocean, is a sea of watery graves for Africans that died who never had proper burials, whose families were not able to say their proper goodbyes. And we also know from other maritime histories that schools of sharks followed slave ships because they knew bodies were being thrown overboard. Sometimes those bodies that were thrown overboard were people that were alive, people that those on the ships believed wouldn't make it, and they believed that maybe they were too sick and they didn't want them to get others on the ship sick as well. One woman, I think she was number 92 or 96, I can't remember, but their names were taken from them and they were given numbers. She was either number 92 or number 96, and she was strapped to a chair. And Shawande Mustakim at Washington University argues that they threw her overboard with a rock and tied to the chair. And the only comment that the crew made was, "I lost a good chair." So the idea of humanity was often lost, and people didn't recognize African captives' humanity along the trade, and as part of the trade. The ventilation on ships was poor. They were sitting tight in a space. They were packed like sardines. If you have ever been to the West African coast, I encourage you to visit the fortifications, the space where they were in, where they went from the door of last return, the last time they left the shores of West Africa. But when they were put on these ships, the journey was sometimes as long as 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the time period, depending on the ship, depending on the navigation technology, depending on the weather. When they were on these ships, as I mentioned, they were stripped, their names were stripped, they were given numbers. And this is one of the first times that historian Stephanie Smallwood and Jennifer Morgan and a number of others argue that the commodification of human beings begins. This is the space where we can see people becoming property. And upon their arrival in the New World, about 38% of those that were taken as part of the transatlantic slave trade were taken to Brazil. And when we're looking at the United States, about 388,000 or 4 to 6% came to what became the United States. The experiences of those in the Middle Passage are well documented. We have records, ledger books from ship surgeons, merchants, sailors, and other traders, and we also have the testimony of the enslaved. We have images from the ships. We know about songs they sang. We know about medical treatment that was administered. And we know that there was also life created at this time. We have evidence of women giving birth in the belly of slave ships. We also know that the experience on the ship differed depending on whether you were male or female. Men were kept in chains the entire time. About once a week, they were taken above deck and allowed to dance around, to exercise, to make sure their muscles wouldn't atrophy. We know that the food and the diet that they were given was very, very poor. Many of them were malnourished, and some of them chose not to eat because they did not want to survive what they were experiencing at the time. Equiano writes, the closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each scarcely had room to turn himself, and we almost suffocated. This experience shaped their lives and haunted those who survived. Upon arrival in the New World, they were sold and given new names, once again being robbed of their identities. But some prevailed, and I'll talk about that later, but some prevailed and found ways to make it through. And if they did not survive, descendants such as myself would not be here today. And I would argue that they survived based on a valuation that could not be commodified, and that was the value of their soul. We have stories of the horrors of the slave ship, the rape and brutality and starvation, seasickness and disease that some Black people experienced. We know that sometimes they mourned, they were in deep sadness and depression, they were traumatized and going through a psychological breakdown because of everything that they were experienced. Once they arrived in the United States, they were sold again. And this time, this is the beginning of what we would now call the domestic slave trade. That trade in human beings lasted, many people date it from 1808, but it actually started in the 1740s, 1750s. We have evidence of people being traded before the closing of the transatlantic slave trade, which in the United States was illegal to bring Africans to the United States after 1808. So the domestic slave trade, which was already in operation, meaning people were being traded on what became American soil prior to 1808, that trade actually sold 1 million souls that we know of. So it's almost 3 times the amount of people were sold during the domestic slave trade as those that came to the United States or what became the United States from West Africa. So the magnitude of the domestic slave trade is often understudied and underutilized, and very, very few understand that there are 2 different trading systems. One was the trade from West Africa, and the other is the trade on American soil. And most enslaved people were traded approximately 4 to 5 times in their lifetime, which means they were traded, they had different owners, they had to go through a different experience, and they talked about the coffles where they were chained by their ankles or chained by their necks and traveled to the deep South or other parts of the South. They were sold, and we know that their values, we have evidence of their values, they were sold from anywhere from $50 to $800 during the 19th century, which in today's money was anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, depending on the time period. And I can provide detailed estimates on the table for you all on the estimates of these values, but I would say the price of an average or mid-sized vehicle is what the price of a human being was, one human being during slavery. Slavery was $1 billion industry. They were sold as commodities to work on plantations, in households, and they were sold for the rest of their natural lives. We have documents that say that. We have valuations of their bodies in shillings, in U.S. dollars. We have estimates of what they were valued when they were first placed on ships, and we also have annual appraisal values of them throughout their lives. They experienced multiple sales. But not only that, they were also sold after they died. Their bodies, their cadavers were sold as part of an illegal underground market that operated very much like the domestic slave trade. It's called the domestic cadaver trade. And their cadavers were sold to medical schools for anatomical research and for dissection, for use in the dissection room. They were sold from $5 to $30 during the 19th century. So what does it mean to put a price on a person's body, and how do we value a person's life in monetary terms? Reparations have been given in this country. They were given during slavery, but they were given to the enslavers. When an enslaver lost an enslaved person because of death, because of murder, or because they ran away, they sometimes, and we have evidence of this, went to court and asked for reimbursement for the loss of that life, and they were paid reparations. It sounds funny for me to call it that, but I have to say it because people always say that reparations have not been paid, but they have been paid. They were paid to those that were not the victims of the system. They were paid to those that operated the system. I want to close with a few remarks about what happens when we think about 12 generations of people experiencing slavery and what happens to African Americans when they became free. We know that African Americans were enslaved longer than we were enslaved longer than we've been free. And I say that we have been enslaved longer than we have been free in this country. Reconstruction lasted 12 years, and the disparities created from slavery are insurmountable. The physical impact of being enslaved for 12 generations has led us to economic disparities, health disparities. We suffer from high blood pressure, diabetes, and other health challenges that we know have been documented. But I want you to remember two things from this testimony. One, that reparations for slavery have already been paid, but they were paid to the enslavers during slavery, and that reparations have been paid for other groups of people in this country. And they are the reason why people argue we cannot pay for them for enslaved people is they say, well, we don't know who was enslaved. We can't trace who was enslaved. But we absolutely can. And I would argue that we have the data, we have the numbers. One excuse that people say is that we don't know exactly how far to trace back and we don't know how to calculate a dollar amount. I beg to differ. We have so many financial records of slavery that we cannot use that as a rationale. The other excuse is that we don't know who the descendants are, but we've made great progress in African American genealogy. And scholars like William Sandy Darity from Duke University would say it doesn't matter about the genealogy, that African Americans, regardless of whether that not they come from the descendants of the enslaved, are experiencing the same disparities that other African Americans are. Reparations were also paid during the War of 1812. State governments then came up with a dollar figure for every enslaver that could document an enslaved person who ran away, and they were given compensation for their lives. Slavery was a theft of natural and human resources. We should begin our discussion with education, and that no plan for reparations should be absent of required readings and learning materials. This is an opportunity for the state of California to lead the effort of healing our nation of our greatest sin. I will leave the dollar amounts to the experts, the economists, the political scientists, the journalists, to people like Darity and Richard America, Nicole Hannah-Jones. They offer some of the best remedies and solutions for reparations. My contribution is and will continue to be the historical record. If you need data and information on slavery, I will provide it. If you want evidence, or as the young students say to these days, receipts, I have them. My advice as you move through this process is to take the time to read and learn about slavery and its aftermath. Inform yourselves and your constituents. Make slavery a part of curriculum, part of state standards, and do not gloss over it in history books. this history in school so that we can heal and move on to creating a more fair and just society. And as always, I start and end with the voices of the enslaved who teach me and have taught me what I know about this institution. Their testimonies and the records of their enslavers have all the information we need to make informed decisions about reparations. Here are just a few words from J.H. Banks for you to ponder as I close. Quote, "Sales take place every day, and oh, the scenes I have witnessed. Husbands sold and their wives and children left for another day's auction, or wives sold one way and husbands and fathers another at the same auction. The distress I saw made a deep impression upon my mind. My intention was diverted from myself by sympathy with others." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Berry, for that incredibly moving testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to acknowledge Professor Stacy Smith. You are recognized.
Thank you. So it's a really enormous honor to be here before you today and to hear the testimony of my fellow panelists. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this process. So my testimony today will cover two major topics. First, the existence of slavery in California and the experiences of enslaved Black people. And then I will also talk about the role that California's early lawmakers and judges played in protecting slavery and promoting anti-Black oppression in the state of California. So the existence of slavery in California seems puzzling to a lot of people at first. Famously, California was supposed to be a free state with an anti-slavery constitution. It entered the federal union as part of the Compromise of 1850, this brokered political deal aimed at appeasing both pro and anti-slavery Americans. Yet at the same time, there's ample evidence that the enslavement of people of African descent happened in California. And what is more, California's early state government protected the institution of slavery and severely restricted Black people's civil rights. And I'm going to aim to explain this kind of disconnect today. So one of the key reasons that the state of California tolerated slavery was that the enslavement of Black people had already taken root before the drafting of the anti-slavery Constitution in 1849. California had been part of Mexico before the United States seized it in the U.S.-Mexico War, which went from 1846 to 1848. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, but American slaveholders began forcibly bringing enslaved Black people into California before, during, and after the U.S.-Mexico War, especially once the gold rush began in 1848. The exact number of enslaved Black people in California is difficult to determine. My detailed analysis of census records reveals approximately 203 enslaved Black people living in California in 1850 and approximately 178 in 1852. These are almost certainly undercounts because Gold Rush census records are notoriously incomplete. Given the fragmented records, I support the findings of a historian named Rudolph Lapp, who estimated that at least 500 to 600 enslaved Black people lived in California during the gold rush. Now, each of these enslaved people almost certainly suffered traumatic uprooting. Going to California meant a forced separation from family, friends, and community by a distance of thousands of miles. And even though slaveholders framed this separation as temporary, most gold seekers spent at least 2 years in California and usually many more years due to the distance and difficulty of the journey. For an example, an enslaved North Carolina man, who is known only as John, arrived in California with slaveholder Robert M. Dixon in 1852 and stayed at least 3 years until Dixon's sudden death in 1855. The historical record is silent about whether John ever returned to North Carolina. His journey to California may have resulted in permanent separation from his family. Now, like John, most of the enslaved people forced to migrate to California were younger men or teenaged boys who ended up working as miners in the gold country. These enslaved miners faced backbreaking and often dangerous working conditions. Placer mining, which was the most common type of mining in the earliest days of the gold rush, involved digging up soil from the beds and banks of rivers and creeks. Sometimes miners dammed up and diverted these bodies of water to get at gold deposits deep in the beds. These techniques often required standing knee-deep or waist-deep in cold, rushing water for several hours each day in the broiling summer heat. Overwork, exposure to the elements, poor sanitation, a lack of nutritious food, and the absence of medical care contributed to long-term illnesses or death by disease. For instance, several enslaved men from western North Carolina died in a cholera epidemic along with their enslaver in Tuolumne County in 1852. Accidents and injuries were also common, and we can see that in the life of an enslaved man from Kentucky known only as Reuben. Reuben died in the American River. He drowned in the American River while working in the gold country in 1851. Now, not all enslaved people worked directly in mining. Women and girls, who made up less than 1/4 of all recorded enslaved people in California, often labored as domestic servants, cooks, or laundresses in private homes, hotels, restaurants, or boarding houses. Skilled domestic workers, in fact, were so scarce and their wages were so high that slaveholders often rented both enslaved women and men to the owners of these establishments. And this practice was called hiring out. Slaveholders then pocketed all or most of the enslaved people's wages from their rented labor. So much like the enslaved people in the U.S. South, those in California also faced brutal violence. In 1850, one slaveholder beat an enslaved man in the town square of San Jose for disobeying him. Local authorities arrested both men, but ultimately determined that the slaveholder was not guilty of assault because his victim was legally his slave. In another case from 1850, an elderly enslaved couple ran away near the town of Sonora. When the slaveholder caught them, he whipped the elderly man until his blood flowed so heavily that it filled his shoes. One of the worst incidents of violence also happened in 1850, this time in Los Angeles. A group of white Southerners chased, shot at, and captured a handful of escaped enslaved people, and then beat them until one nearly died. The forced journey to California resulted in diverse outcomes for the enslaved people who survived it. Many people probably worked in California for a few years before returning to enslavement in the South. Others, especially those who were allowed to keep a small portion of their wages from hiring out or from digging gold, saved enough money to purchase their freedom. And finally, some enslaved people labored under formal or informal indenture agreements by which they promised to work for a certain number of years in California in exchange for their freedom. Enslaved people who gained their own freedom might then also earn enough money eventually to free their family members. Now, of course, many enslaved people also saw California as a place where they could seize their own freedom or renegotiate the terms of their enslavement. The California gold country was large, isolated, and full of diverse people, including anti-slavery Black and white Northerners. It was generally far easier to run away, hide, and find allies in California than it was in the southern slave states. But it's important to remember, and I really always emphasize this, that all enslaved people who went west were forced to leave their family members and communities behind in the South. Escape, therefore, was not a viable option for many enslaved people because staying with slaveholders was their only way to maintain their family ties most of the time. Slaveholders, in effect, used their control over enslaved people's family members as leverage to force them to cooperate in California. And for this reason, enslaved people may have been more likely to resist in other ways. Some, for instance, refused to work or escaped temporarily until they were allowed to keep more of their earnings. And this may have been a more secure path to freedom if they earned enough to buy themselves and their family members out of slavery. Now, California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution did little to stop the violence and exploitation that enslaved people suffered. The new constitution proclaimed that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crimes, shall ever be tolerated in this state, end quote. The problem was that slavery already existed in the state and was already being tolerated there. Furthermore, the Constitution was silent about what should happen to enslaved people in the state. It was one thing for the California Constitution to declare that slavery would not be tolerated. It was quite another thing actually to criminalize slavery, emancipate enslaved people, punish slaveholders, and give Black people protections for their freedoms. Pro-slavery white Southerners took advantage of this discrepancy to perpetuate slavery in California. During California's 1849 Constitutional Convention, pro-slavery delegates from the South had quietly accepted a pro-slavery provision banning slavery without protest or discussion. After statehood, however, a disproportionately large number of pro-slavery men won political office in California. White Southerners with pro-slavery views were prominent in the state legislature, the state courts, including the state Supreme Court, and among California's representatives in Congress. During the 1850s, these men used their newfound power to commit the state of California to protecting slaveholders' rights by passing and upholding laws that skirted around the anti-slavery Constitution. The California government's most pro-slavery action was passing and enforcing a state fugitive slave law in 1852. Pro-slavery Southerners were angry to discover that the federal fugitive slave law of 1850, which was this really harsh new law to help slave catchers chase down and re-enslave people who ran away, did not apply to most cases in California. Slaveholders could only use the federal law to catch and re-enslave people who escaped across state lines, not those who ran away within the state's borders. In 1852, the California state legislature addressed this issue by greatly expanding the definition of who counted as a fugitive slave. California's new state law defined a fugitive slave as any enslaved person who arrived in the state prior to official statehood in September 1850, but who refused to return to the slave states with their enslaver. These people were subject to arrest and deportation back to the U.S. South. Now, the legal rationale for this law was that California's anti-slavery constitution did not officially go into force until the moment of statehood. Before then, California was a California was a federal territory. California was a federal territory where, according to pro-slavery legal theory, the U.S. Constitution entitled all citizens to migrate freely with any type of property they might own, including property in human beings. Therefore, the law's supporters argued that California had a constitutional duty to protect the rights of slaveholders who arrived before official statehood. Now, the passage of this fugitive slave law made California an outlier among free states. I think that's a really important thing to understand. In the northeastern United States, places like New England, many free states resisted helping capture fugitive slaves. The California Fugitive Slave Law of 1852, on the other hand, authorized slaveholders to use violent means to capture enslaved people. It also ordered state officials to assist in the capture and arrest of enslaved people, or they would face removal from office and heavy fines. Finally, the California Fugitive Slave Law, like the federal version, strictly prohibited accused fugitives from testifying in their own defense. California also already had laws banning non-white testimony in court cases involving white people, and these laws compounded this injustice. Free Black activists, who were enslaved people's greatest allies, could not be witnesses in any court proceedings. Only so-called redeeming feature of the California Fugitive Slave Law was its short enforcement period. Slaveholders were supposed to have just 1 year to arrest and deport people who they claimed were runaway slaves. But in 1853, California legislators renewed the fugitive slave law for another year. They did the same thing again in 1854. This meant that for 3 years, from 1852 to 1855, anyone accused of being a fugitive slave could be chased down, dragged before a court, and sent back to lifelong slavery in the South, even if they had been living in the free state of California for 5 years or more. Now, just a few months after the passage of the state fugitive slave law, free Black activists, with the assistance of white attorneys, brought a test case called In re Perkins all the way to the California Supreme Court. The state's Supreme Court justices decided that 3 Black men, Carter Perkins, Robert Perkins, and Sandy Jones, should be returned to enslavement in Mississippi because they had arrived with their enslaver before official statehood. The court ruled that the anti-slavery section of the California Constitution was only a, quote, declaration of a principle, end quote. The Constitution said the state would not tolerate slavery, but California had no laws in place to enforce this decree. So the justices also agreed with the state legislature that California could not emancipate enslaved people who arrived before official statehood. The court accepted that extreme pro-slavery legal theory that the U.S. Constitution guaranteed slaveholders the right to bring enslaved people into the federal territories without restrictions. So this decision by the California Supreme Court foreshadowed the ruling in the much more famous case of Dred Scott versus Sandford 5 years later in 1857. In that landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not close slavery out of any of the federal territories. Altogether, California courts tried at least 10 cases involving the freedom of 13 people under this state fugitive slave law between the years of 1852 and 1855. In 5 of those 10 cases, the courts returned the accused runaways, 7 people total, to slavery. These numbers may seem small, but this list only includes cases for which documentation still exists. These numbers also do not accurately reflect the terror that all Black people, free or enslaved, would have suffered under this law. When combined with the exclusion of Black court testimony against whites, the California fugitive slave law made every Black person vulnerable to being accused, arrested, or deported without being able to defend themselves. Finally, it's also important to note the symbolic and political significance of the California fugitive slave law. In supporting this law, the California legislature and courts signaled their sympathy with the Southern slave states and pro-slavery interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the California legislature finally let the state fugitive slave law lapse in 1855, but fugitive slave cases continued. At least 6 additional cases involving the freedom of 19 people came before the California courts after 1855. All of these cases did eventually lead to the freedom of the enslaved people in question. But in one particular case, that of Archie Lee, which happened in 1857 through 1858, the pro-slavery California Supreme Court made every effort to return the person to enslavement. Lee's enslaver had brought the enslaved man to California years after statehood and the lapse of the fugitive slave law. Still, the justices ruled that the man who claimed ownership of Archie Lee was so young, ill, and ignorant of California's laws that he should not be punished by being deprived of his human property. It took multiple lawsuits by free Black Californians and intervention by federal legal officials to secure Archie Lee's freedom. Now, throughout the 1850s, California's political leaders were also complicit in other types of anti-Black legislation. California's 1849 Constitutional Convention delegates restricted the right to vote to white male citizens, and they also debated a Black exclusion law to prohibit all future African American migration to the state. The Black exclusion law did not make it into the Constitution, but at the urging of Peter Burnett, California's first governor, the legislature attempted to pass a Black exclusion law 4 times in the 1850s. And in addition to barring Black court testimony against whites, the California legislature also prohibited interracial marriage between Black and white people, excluded Black people from making homestead claims in the state courts, denied state funding for Black children to attend public schools, and refused to acknowledge petitions from Black activists seeking to change these unjust laws. The vicious anti-Black tone of state politics prompted many Black Californians to leave the state in search of greater freedom and equality. Starting in 1858, up to 800 Black men, women, and children migrated north to the colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia, where many became British subjects. Now, the Civil War and Reconstruction brought important victories and bitter defeats for California's Black activists. In 1863, after 12 years of petitioning, activists finally convinced the California state legislature, which was now dominated by anti-slavery Republicans, to repeal the ban on African American court testimony against whites. The late 1860s, however, saw the return of anti-Black legislation. Hostile Democrats retook the legislature and refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, establishing Black citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment, prohibiting racial discrimination against voters. California would not ratify these critical pieces of legislation until almost a century later during the Civil Rights Movement. In the meantime, California Supreme Court set another destructive precedent that the rest of the nation would eventually follow. In the 1874 case of Ward v. Flood, California Supreme Court justices ruled that segregation in the state's public schools was legal so long as Black children and white children had equal access to similar educational facilities. 22 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court adopted a similar, quote-unquote, separate but equal principle in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This famous decision upheld the segregation of public facilities in the United States for almost 60 years. As with many things, California was ahead of its time, but in this case, tragically, the state led the way in establishing anti-Black racial oppression across the United States. So in closing, I'd just like to say a little bit about my reasons for testifying today. I am a white American who, like a large number of white Americans, is descended from slaveholders. The 1830 U.S. Census shows that one of my ancestors, Arthur Jernigan of Tennessee, owned and claimed as his property 7 human beings. These enslaved people were likely a family group made up of parents and children, but we'll never know for sure because the census has no information about them, not even their names. The 1840 census showed that the Jernigans, my ancestors, no longer owned enslaved people. And while it's possible that my ancestors set these people free, the more likely horrible reality is that he sold them off to pay debts or to buy land. If so, he probably did not sell them as a family group, but as individuals, ensuring that they were separated from their loved ones forever. As a white person from an upper middle class family, I recognize that the privileges I have benefited from, economic security, access to higher education, and even my own bodily safety, are built on the stolen intellect, labor, and skills of enslaved people who my ancestors traumatically ripped away from their homes and families. For me, reparations means that white people like myself need to acknowledge not just the national debt that the United States owes to Black people for building the economic, social, and cultural foundations of this country. Reparations also entail a really deeply personal process of reflection about how to compensate Black Americans for the generational wealth and social upward mobility that white families like my own have gained from the exploitation and attempted destruction of Black families. I hope that my testimony today can help the state of California and all Californians grapple with these difficult questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith, for that incredibly thorough expert testimony. Now, last but not least, I would like to recognize John Burgess. You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jonathan Burgess, and I'm here to testify. on behalf of the entire Burgess family, but all the pioneers that came to Gold Country and were in California throughout the year 1849 and beyond. I'm fifth generation Californian. The search, I'll start by saying this, is that I've been in search of truthful history for over 50 years, and it started with my mother. And it reignited itself about 4 years ago when my twin brother and I were approached, better known as the Burgess Brothers, to help save the Emmanuel Church in Coloma, California, where gold was discovered. My mother had passed on, our mother had passed on, and we remembered there being remnants of the ownership of an African church. Her mom said, your great-grandfather owned a church. And as we're going through this research and trying to save this church, we found a lot of information. And before I even go into the information, I just want to say this and back up a little bit. The last 48 hours, the last 72 hours have been horrendous. I'm going to try and do my best to cover over 100 years, of our family being here, 172 years in 10 minutes. So I hope that there are questions afterwards. But I'll say in the last 48 hours, I've been accused of spinning history for my personal gain publicly. I've been accused of doing this just for personal wealth. I'm doing this for every descendant of slavery in this state of California, because it's specific to California. I don't know any different. And so I'll say this, I'm in seeking truth. And to Dr. Brown's point, because he makes it all the time, is that we've been led untruthful information. I just want truthful history. So that being said, in search of, I'm going to go back and tell you about my mother. I remember as a child going up to Coloma with my Uncle Marion, who was the oldest of the three brothers. They call them the Burgess boys in books that are written today, even though they were grown men. My Uncle Marion, by the time I was old enough to go to Coloma, he could just point and cry. And it wasn't until recently that I realized what those tears represented. In the last 72 hours, thanks to the Department of Justice, I was informed that, yes, laws were actually passed through the legislation to allow the governor, well, not the governor, the attorney general and legislators to condemn property and not pay families. I was also made aware of that my grandfather and his two brothers, my Uncle Marion, were threatened to be prosecuted by the same state that's supposed to be free in the event they didn't sell their land. And what I know now from seeking all this truth is that the land was all that we had left. We had farmland, lots of it, because our time in Coloma started in 1849 when my great-great-grandfather was brought to California. Picture sits there behind me. His name was Rufus Burgess. That hung over our fireplace for years. My mother always told me, my father, that's your great-grandfather. He was one of the first pioneers to actually arrive in the town of Coloma. And my dad documents he was there when gold was discovered. Censored records show Rufus Burgess in El Dorado County in 1849. And if you look at Miss Beasley's book, Delilah Beasley, he's the only African-American man listed in the town of Coloma in 1849. And he established a lot, orchards, farmland, even the African church, which no one seems to know about today, although there are records and it was clearly documented. The family holds deeds today. As far as I'm concerned, that African church is the Emmanuel Church, and it's surrounded by orchards, which again, people, parts of institutions, don't want that to come true. So not only did it establish all that, like most early gold miners that came here, they worked and got their freedom. Thanks to Marilyn Demas, she was a true historian and a truth seeker. Tina Alexander has been extremely helpful as well in some of the state parks. But thanks to them, I found that not only was he brought here, he was sold once he was here. See, I struggle with the problem or the issue of knowing that this man behind me was listed as my great-grandfather, but yet we had his Bible, something that families keep for years. And inside his Bible was an autobiography. I didn't understand why, and I questioned my mom. Mom, why does he have the name Nelson? That's Rufus Burgess. And thanks to him, and he tells you his life, he could read and write. He left us a map, a gold mine. But these stories have been unacknowledged by the state of California. It wasn't until my adulthood and my own research that I was able to piece together how, in fact, he became Nelson Bell. And I question, as I'm doing the research, and these 4 years of research, going through the state parks, working with the institutions, and I don't blame the institutions because at the end of the day, California is an institution. And the institutions never worked for us, Black people in America, Black people in California. So how can I expect those people that work for the institution to help me? I'm hoping that you guys do that. But in discovering the Marshall Gold discovery, as I'm doing research, the binder, there's a white binder that was there. My mother wrote letters. She wrote letters back in the 70s, 80s, 90s about our family, so the park knew about it. Nelson Bell, who's Rufus Burgess, was on the first map of 1857, but sadly, when you go to the park today, there's no mention of any existence of his house or him. In fact, the Burgess family, who established a lot, was part of the Colored Citizens Convention. My great-grandfather actually is listed as a secretary treasurer in the church building in 1862. I couldn't understand why reverends and pastors around the nation weren't outraged that when you go to the gold discovery site, there's no mention. There's a Chinese church or building. There's a Methodist church or building. And there is also a Catholic church or building. And documents will share, I care not to get into them now, that the Methodist church actually became the African church. But people don't want to believe that. So I ask myself these questions. Question, why state park officials or the institutions, the California institutions, and not the people in the parks, because they work there and understand it. They make little to no mention of the pioneer Burgess family when so much was established, and yet there's legislation showing the land that was condemned. I asked why the home of Nelson Bell, who was actually listed as the only Black man, the mulatto in the town, is not talked about. In fact, my last visit at the church, I asked them, what park officials, I asked when they were going to tell me how they wanted to talk about the site of gold discovery. I asked them, why don't we talk about what we know? Why is the home of Nelson Bell not listed on the map? I can go to the park today. Do you know what it would make little Black kids feel like to go and see and know that something was established? See, our institutions have not only hurt the direct descendants, it's hurt others from fabricated stories. There's something that says dead people don't tell tales. You're right, they don't. They can't lie. They can't make up anymore. And all I want is the truth. That's all I wanted. But I found it. And I hope that you guys ask questions. Frequently in visiting the park, my brother and I were asked once they found out we're Burgess, what do you know about the land on the north side of the hill? What am I supposed to know about the land on the north side of the hill? I don't know. I know that our family was in the town from 1849 until they were forced out of the town. And yet on the first township map of Coloma, there's not one African American listed. In fact, I know that Nelson Bell, well, he went back to using the name Rufus at some point, but he was buried under a slave named Nelson Bell. I know in my own research that Dr. Berry mentioned that there were a number of people in El Dorado. I know that there were colored citizens that were sending money to fund the convention from their gold digging. And I know there was a preaching point in El Dorado County. Reverend Jennifer was actually appointed for 6 preaching points, with Coloma being a stop. That's more than 100 people. In fact, there's documents of a couple hundred people being inside the church. There's a 2006 document that the State of California Parks Division knew of the existence of the building, but requested the late Marilyn Demas to not reveal the site for fear of vandalism. And yet when I go there today, I'm told there was an African church that our family once owned. See, maps are a figment of imagination. The worst thing I'd say is that, our historic home that had been in the family since the early 1860s was razed in 1950 by state employees. Nobody seems to know where that home was. Just recently, I was given a document, thanks to DOJ, of what they believe is the Burgess home. And I'd question where that actual home was, because my mother wrote documents, and I know from records and deeds that we own multiple homes now. But yet the property was condemned, for which you could pay nothing for it. And although all of our property, there was only one parcel of property that my great-grandmother Josephine sold, and she sold it to Mr. Gallagher, who actually came after the gold rush. She sold the property in 1901, but Gallagher, I think, arrived in 1860. And I've reached out to Assemblymember Gallagher because I know there's some correlation and relation, but silence is complacency. I don't know the reality behind it, but I do know that there was a bunch of land behind the blacksmith range hall. And in books I've seen is that Melvin Gallagher Ranch. Melvin Gallagher was born the same time my grandfather was, and we had been in the town already at least 10, 15, 20 years and established a great deal. I'll say this. Our family has endured a lot. And not only our family from the falsities of what California's done, other families have endured it too. When I say other families, it's not anyone's fault that people were made to be something that they're not. In fact, I'd be embarrassed if I knew that my direct descendant had did things that have been done to us. And there may be a call, and I hate to say it, but there may be a call for reparations for that too, because it was the institution that actually put these people up to be on pedestals and didn't tell the true history. And yet they suppressed our history. And so I would ask that this task force and this council, I was asked to put together some things of what reparations looks like. Well, my family's been without land, been forced off of land. And it was farmland. There are documents of actually farming, sending fruit throughout the valley of Coloma, El Dorado, and Placer counties. I'd ask that the land that we know, which I believe Nelson Bell, his home, I believe to be where the California State Library, Marshall Discovery Library is sitting on that property. And now when I go to state parks or prisons, I look at properties different. What I've learned is that the tactics that were used here were used all over the place. I'd ask to put together a short list of what reparation would look like, and I'll say something real quick. The institutions, I've got a list. The institutions were, in fact, responsible. The state of California is one of them. Our family doesn't need to have any more loss. I've lost both my parents, 2 daughters to COVID, and I've got contracted it myself. I want immediate restitution. I've got a brother that's been sitting behind institutional bars for the last 27 years for a murder he didn't commit, but yet the institution's here. And so I would ask the governor, an executive order, the same way, that an order was just about done to kick my grandfather and his brothers off of their land, to do the same for the Burgess family. And that comes with reinstoring property that was taken, wrongfully taken. And for the people up there that are sitting on the property today that own it, it's not your fault. And I'd say this, I don't want to kick you off. That's why reparations is due too. Because you had no idea that when the maps were there in 1872 or whenever they were placed and this reconstruction occurred, what you were getting into. And if you did, can't say that I wouldn't have taken advantage of it too, but you've maintained the property this long. But for any state building, any state park, any state institution, those properties should be returned to actual owners and leases enacted for 200 years, and they pay all the back pay with restitution. That would be fine for the Burgess family and any other family that's proven whose land was wrongfully taken through legislative practices that discriminated against descendants of slaves in California. My name's Jonathan Burgess, and I'll rest the mic and be open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess, for that incredibly moving and thorough personal testimony. At this time, we have an hour for comments and questions from task force members that will be posed to Professor Smith, Professor Berry, and Mr. Burgess. At this time, Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the task force, to our guests who've given their perspective. You know, this is a very emotional and sad occasion for me personally. Because we have attempted in America to tell the story. But because we so much have been infected with bias, racist action, and often imposed upon by narratives that were not our story, but his story, and consequently not true history. I wish to say that I'm a witness also to these fine presenters. But let me tell the whole story. The whole story. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. We should stop sanitizing the evil ways of one Peter Burnett. You've been too kind to him in the history books. And Ms. Smith, the truth be told, it was Peter Burnett who led the first wagon train westward in 1843. And he came from that state of Tennessee, where one Andrew Jackson also came from. So he was infected with this evil of race and oppression. He was reared in Missouri, but when he came westward in 1843, one of his orders for that wagon train that he led was that no blacks or mulattoes would be permitted to be a part of that wagon train. And when he got up to the Oregon Territory, what did he do when he settled that first little town? He established an ordinance not about how a cabin should be built or how a road should be built, but it was the Peter Burnett flogging law that stipulated any black or mulatto who was caught in that town would be beaten every 6 months until he or she left town. And the man came down here in 1848 to California, still leaving droppings of his infectious, racist, inhumane, evil mind. And he got involved in politics and became the first governor from 1849 to 1851. And the whole story, Ms. Smith, is that he was on that Supreme Court after even he left office in disgrace because some debts in the Midwest caught up with him. And all of this is documented in a book entitled The Troubled Life of Peter Burnett. But the point I want to make is, this man was responsible for voting with the minority opinion on that Supreme Court of the state of California when that civil rights case of R.C. Lee was argued. He was the one who sided with enslavement. He was the one who infected this state with that virus of racist politics. So I hope that when we tell the story from now on, we tell the whole truth, not sanitize it, that this state has been mean to black folks because from the very beginning, the man who was the governor was indeed an evil racist and was against Native Americans. He pushed legislation against them, and also anti-immigration matters against Asians, and more specifically, Chinese. Finally, I want to say, Madam Chair and friends, thanks for indulging me. I speak as a witness, also from the state of Mississippi, where R.C. Lee came from, with Stovall. Stovall tried to hire him out to raise money to take care of his personal needs and to build a school up in Sacramento. Stovall. Yes. Ultimately, he went back to Mississippi. But R.C. Lee's days were cut short in this earth because he, too, was a part of that group of the migration contingency that left in 1858 because blacks could not testify in courts. They could not get schooling. They could not get housing. They could not get jobs. They got on that ship, the Commodore, at the invitation of Governor Douglas, who said, if they won't respect you in California and Mississippi and give you your rights, come on up to British Columbia. I've set aside some land on Victoria Island. And out of that contingency, there were founders of the historic Third Baptist Church that I have pastored now for 45 years. And they built that community. And they were achievers. And they did not accept this notion that they were inferior and that they were not persons of dignity and resource and ability.